Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America. On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old. An anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, we talk to prominent US citizens not just about their country's past and present, but also about its future. What, I ask my American guests, will be the 21st century fate of their now venerable republic? Hello, everybody. Last year, best-selling book came out by Fareed Zakaria, Age of Revolutions, Progress and Backlash from 1600 to the present. Fareed doesn't need much of an introduction, one of America's leading thinkers on politics and history. The book is out right now in paperback. We've had a year, Fareed, since publication. Has your thesis in the book, do you think, over the last year, has it been proved more or less right? I know you wrote this book, Age of Revolutions, to underline the revolutionary quality of our own age?
I think it's been pretty powerfully confirmed in the sense of Trump's reelection. So the basic thesis of the book is, that every time you look around in history and see massive shifts in technology, the nature of economics, the rise of globalization in our case, major cultural transformations, you always get a backlash, and that backlash tends to often take a form, a kind of cultural political form. And I wrote it, before Trump was reelected. In fact, at a time when most people thought either Biden would be reelected or Biden would step down and another Democrat would come in, and Trump was quite unpopular. But what Trump's reelection showed is that, and this is the thesis of the book, that we're in this for a long run. We are going through a long period of backlash to several decades of enormous transforming changes technologically, economically, and we should expect that this is going to go on for a while, and that societies are going to be navigating this backlash for a long time to come.
I think Trump, my sense at least, is he presents himself as a revolutionary. A lot of his critics, of course, present him as a reactionary. Is he a revolutionary in your mind, or is he an accident of history who happens to show up in a revolutionary time and talks the language of revolution, but is in fact a reactionary?
It's a very good question, because Trump is a very unusual figure. So if you were to say, is he a revolutionary in the style of Lenin, or somebody who had thought about this, conceived of it, articulated a program, a revolutionary program, then gains power and implements that revolutionary program? No, that is not Donald Trump. Donald Trump is a kind of intuitive political opportunist who, I think, more than anything else, sensed where the wave was going and found a way to ride that wave better than almost anybody else. What do I mean by that? Take the 2016 primary race among the Republicans, because that's the really most interesting moment. Because the 2016 election, as you know, was a kind of fluke. It could have gone either way. But the 2016 primary, you had 16 Republican candidates, very serious people, governors, senators. You had the CEO, the former CEO of Hewlett Packard, and 15 of them presented the old Republican creed, what I would call the kind of Reagan formula. What was the Republican Party in favor of? It was primarily and principally defined by being in support of free trade, free markets, balanced budgets, cutting entitlement spending like Social Security and Medicare, and a robust foreign policy that was devoted to spreading freedom, right? Think of George Bush, the last Republican president. Well, Trump, 15 of them recited the Reagan mantra. Trump was the only guy who didn't, really. And the reason, I think, is that he sensed, being a good salesman, he walked into those rooms in the Republican Party and those meetings he would hold, and he realized that the Republican Party was different, that the base of the Republican Party was now a white working class base deeply resentful about many of these forces that the Republican elites had been celebrating, deeply resentful of free trade, immigration, multiculturalism, maybe even women's rights, minority rights. And his message was almost entirely cultural. If you watch those town halls and those rallies he would do, his basic message had nothing to do with the Reagan formula. It was the opposite. It was, we're going to, we hate the Chinese. We hate basically it was sort of like the Chinese are taking your factories. The Mexicans are taking your jobs. The Muslims are trying to kill you. I'll beat them all up. You'll be great again. That was the Trump formula. And so in a sense, he was an opportunist who took that message. Now, your broader question of is this revolutionary or reactionary? Is it really moving forward about that? There's a huge debate about, of course, and I would say honestly, it's a mix of both, and we can talk more about that.
A mix of both. Let me ask you your analysis of how history works, Fareed. This is a history book. It's not a book about Trump. You mentioned Lenin. Lenin was so aware, indeed, of famous story of Lenin. He was so aware of living in revolutionary times and shaping history that he famously gave up chess to concentrate on the revolution. And of course, he did shape 20th century history. I think that was an anecdote from Solzhenitsyn's book on Lenin in Zurich. How does history work in your analysis? You've written this book on the history of modern revolutions. Are most individuals aware of shaping history in revolutionary terms? You note Trump. One wonders how well versed he is in history. Certainly, there are characters, though, in the MAGA movement, like Steve Bannon, who has, in my view, at least, a Leninist quality, who are aware of shaping history. How does history work? Are people are the great actors aware of making revolutions?
Again, you ask a totally fascinating question, because this is something that I think a great deal about, because I was trained as a social scientist, not a historian, but with a very deep exposure to history. My undergraduate major was in history, I've always, and of course in social science, the impulse is to look for the broad structural features of something. What caused this? What were the economic dynamics? What were the technological? What were the
Yeah,
broader
the
political?
Barrington Moore Theatre Scotchpole School of
Exactly,
History.
exactly. Sam Huntington was my dissertation advisor, so
At
very much
Harvard, of course.
in that world. And so I think that I would confess to believing that at the end of the day, the broadest, most powerful currents that shape history tend to be these larger structural factors. So when you look at my book, the thing that is striking is the rise of the Dutch, which really marks the beginning, in my opinion, of modern history, because it is the break with thousands of years of economic stagnation. It's the first moment where human beings begin to see sustained rises in per capita income, in their standards of living. And it happens because of a technological economic revolution that takes place in this tiny country nestled in the North Atlantic, the Netherlands. And that is the motor. And then that model gets transported to Britain, and then Britain embraces it even more strongly and dominates the world, and therefore that model suddenly starts to spread everywhere, most importantly the United States. So those structural forces are real, and you cannot pretend that they don't matter, or that some individual, nobody even remembers who was running the Netherlands in that period. But when you're living through history, you are aware of the contingencies, right? So you say to yourself, all that is true, but if in 2016 Hillary Clinton had paid attention to her husband and gone to those swing states, um, and Trump had lost, not only would he have lost, but this is the really interesting thought experiment. He would have lost, and the Republican Party would have taken from that loss the lesson: we went down a crazy rabbit hole of populism. We lost. we need to go back to our roots. And so the Paul Ryan Republican Party, the libertarian free market Republican Party, would have gotten a new lease on life. Now, the structuralist in me, the social scientist, would say, yeah, but then this populist, the reality of the new Republican Party as a white working class, culturally resentful party is real, and maybe there would have been another 5 years of the old model, but eventually it would have broken through. And I kind of probably believe that. But and that's why I say, if you look at it historically and as a scholar, you're struck by the great forces of history. But if you live through this stuff, you say to yourself, oh my God, if Biden had just not allowed these millions of people to come through the border, and if he had stepped down as he said he was going to, couldn't we have seen another Democrat in 2024? And what would that mean? Right? So there's this push and pull.
Yeah, and I probably shouldn't say this, but it's my own show, so I'm allowed to say whatever I like. Maybe the lesson from this is in revolutionary times, women should listen to the advice of their husbands. Fareed, I was in Amsterdam a couple of months ago with my wife. Of course, we dutifully went to the Rijksmuseum, and as always, I love the paintings, particularly of Vermeer, because they strike me as in their own way revolutionary. So I take your point that nobody here, I certainly can't, you've already acknowledged you can't, nobody can name the Robespierre or the Lenin or the Bismarck of the Dutch Revolution, but we can name Vermeer and Rembrandt. When we look for revolution in your narrative, or when you were looking for revolution, where do you look? I mean, it's all very well looking politically, but shouldn't one look at art, literature, film? Aren't they, in some ways, more fertile grounds for discovering how the traditional world was turned upside down? All you need to do is look at one of Vermeer's perspectives and his use of light to understand the Dutch Revolution.
Yeah, and it's particularly true of the kind of revolutions that I spend a fair amount of time in the book on, which are the kind of successful liberal revolutions, which are the revolutions which don't involve massive transformative chaos and bloodshed and people being hung and guillotined and show trials, right? That's the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution. But when you look at the Dutch Revolution, when you look at the Glorious Revolution, when you look at the American, the transformation of America, what you're seeing is something, a quieter revolution of law and liberty and democracy.
And of individualism. I mean, that's the essence, of course, of Vermeer and Rembrandt.
Exactly. And that's where we get to the paintings. The enormous break that takes place in the Netherlands is that these painters decide that what they are going to do as the most important part of their art is they are going to paint ordinary people, and they're going to paint ordinary scenes, and they're going to paint ordinary streets. And then they're going to paint merchants and people in their daily life. People have to remember what a break this was, right? Because Western art had been almost single-mindedly devoted to one thing, which was the glorification of God. And that was always seen as the only appropriate subject that art could devote itself to. And people like Vermeer and Rembrandt, and Vermeer, you're right to point to particularly, say, no, it is the quotidian life of ordinary human beings that is the most interesting thing, the most divine in its own way.
And in an inner life, just looking,
Exactly.
thinking of the lady in blue and acknowledging that our essence somehow lies inside us. And
exactly. If you think
don't
of the
even know
Enlightenment
what
as
people are thinking.
right, if you think of the Enlightenment as people have famously said, turning the entire worldview away from the idea that divinity is at the center of life, but that no, instead the human being is at the center of life. Those Vermeers, where the focus is entirely on the inner lives of these very ordinary people, milkmaids, just some bourgeois lady.
So, borrowing from thinking, people like Isaiah Berlin and maybe even the classical liberals, could one argue, Fareed, that the really revolutionary quality of liberalism and this is the narrative that you focus on in the book and addressing, of course, in current America, is outside politics?
I think very powerfully so. It's outside politics in this sense that it is meant to be, as you say, about celebrating the individualism of a human being, that person's individual autonomy, uh, the ability to think what you want, do what you want, believe what you want, and to construct your own conception of what a good life is. That is at the heart, I think, of liberalism, and I mean liberalism, small l, liberalism as in enlightenment, the philosophy that came out of the Enlightenment. Um, in order to achieve that life, there is a political dimension to it, right? The state has to give you the space to allow you to live that life, and it has to not try to impose its own conception of what a good life is, the way the old religiously dominated monarchies of Europe might have done, the way the communist societies did, the way Islamic theocracies do. So there is an act of politics in saying, we're seeding you this space and this zone. But in its essence, yeah, it's almost it's not anti-political, but it's apolitical.
How did the American narrative fit in here? I know Tim Wu's review, and Tim's an old friend of mine, his review in the New York Times was a little upset that you didn't focus on the bloody revolutions of France and Russia and China. Do you see the American Revolution as the essential model for liberal revolution?
No, it's a kind of odd model because I think that this is something Americans don't like to admit and talk about. But in its fundamental form, the American Revolution was really a war of independence, because what the revolutionaries were asking for, and this is absolutely clear in the early part of the revolution, they were asking for a restoration of the rights they had as English colonialists living under the kind of Tudor system that had been established when they had come to America. What they resented was what they saw as a kind of break in London with what had been English liberalism, and all of a sudden the state is getting is making these demands and reaching into America in a way that they believed was inappropriate. So in a very important political sense, it is of course a landmark event, because you are throwing off the shackles of an imperial superpower, and you are establishing a democracy. You're going from a monarchy to a democracy. But again, remember, you are going from the most constitutional monarchy in the world, where Parliament had the strongest rights and powers. So it was not like this was some kind of tyrannical absolutism. And in fact, for the first part of the revolution, there is a tendency to say the king is okay. It's Parliament that is trying to take all these powers, and so it's a complicated revolution, because these were the most liberal people in the most liberal country in the world, who had moved to America and wanted to retain that liberalism. Now, in the course of the revolution, it changes and it gets radicalized. But in the way I mean it, and this is the reason I think I downplay 1776 and 1789 for the purposes of my book right now, is that they're not social economic revolutions. So the structure of the American society is kept wholly intact. Slavery, which is essentially an old fashioned medieval system, is kept entirely intact. Even the big landowning feudal structure in the North is kept entirely intact. There was one effort to change that, the Whiskey Rebellion, and it was savagely put down by Northerners. So, what really changes America is the Industrial Revolution and the Civil War about 100 years later.
So it seems to be, in an odd way, a kind of irony about the American Revolution, which is, of course, in many ways was best observed, not the revolution, but the post-independence America by Tocqueville in the 19th century. That while the liberal revolution was, as you said earlier, perhaps the revolution of Vermeer and Rembrandt and the celebration of the inner life and conscience and individual rights and all the rest of it, the American contribution, ironically, to the canon of revolutions is the politics of liberalism, and the word we use to describe that is democracy. Is that fair, Fareed?
That's very well put. It's the first institutionalization of Enlightenment liberalism de novo. You know, the British and the Dutch have it, but they're layering liberalism and Enlightenment ideas about politics onto an existing medieval system that was not like that, right? That's why you have the complexity of the British Constitution, where the king exists, the monarchy exists, whereas in America, you're starting from scratch. And so you can implement almost de novo whatever the ideas are. So it's like Montesquieu put into practice for the first time on a blank slate. And that happens in no other country. Now, it's an exaggeration of what actually happened in America, because again, we were drawing on ideas and traditions that were part of the colonial structure of being English settlers in America. But in some important intellectual and political ways, it was the sharpest break from the past you had in any society up to that point.
So does that explain the paradox of men like Thomas Jefferson, who on the one hand celebrated independence and democracy, and on the other hand were slave owners themselves?
I never thought of it that way, but I think you're exactly right. Like that, in Jefferson and Washington, you have what I just said, playing out in one person, which is they came from a world in which they were aristocrats and they were lords of the manor, and there were serfs in these manors, slaves, and yet their thoughts were liberal Enlightenment thoughts, and so they created a country that was built on the ideas, but did not get rid of the accumulated detritus of history. They might have not called it detritus, but the accumulated baggage of history.
You mentioned the Industrial Revolution as being the thing that made America world historic in some ways. Are we at the end of that Industrial Revolution now, Fareed?
I think we are. I think that in the last 30 years, the leading powers of the world, and particularly the United States, have moved decisively into a post-industrial age. Daniel Bell very presciently wrote about it in the 1960s. He called it the coming of the post-industrial order or age. But it took a while. I mean, he saw something that was happening, and with software and now with AI, you really are in a world where everybody who is doing something that is important in the economy is, in a sense, I think Robert Reich coined this phrase, a symbolic analyst, meaning that person manipulates words, computer code, images, ideas, numbers for a living. Think about it. I've almost described the entire service economy, right? It's lawyers, bankers, consultants, journalists, graphic artists, computer programmers. That whole world, which is 80% of American employment, is non-material. And the material world, the people who push physical stuff for a living, it does exist, but it's a smaller, less consequential part of the world. And that reality, I think, probably tells you that the industrial age is ended. There's one sense in which it hasn't, which is the Industrial Revolution was fundamentally an energy revolution. It was a revolution designed to produce inanimate energy, right? The key was the steam engine. And that piece of it, we are still very much in, which is we are constantly searching as human society develops. The one thing that the Industrial Revolution began, we are still completely wedded to, which is we need energy. Everything we do needs energy. And it turns out that the ultimate expression of the post-industrial age, which is the manufacturing of intelligence, relies even more dramatically on energy than almost anything else.
Yeah, and that, of course, brings up the China issue. We'll come to that in a minute. Some people might be listening and thinking, well, yes, of course, there's a profound shift in the nature of industrial to networked or digital society. But why should that change democracy and individual rights?
Well, it's a good question, but it's probably because the way in which these new waves come uh, is is that they're very disruptive. They change everything about the economy. They change the structure of societies, and all of that then has an impact, right? So one of the things about the Industrial Revolution was it was quite centralizing, because what you needed it was, everything had to be done in mass, in huge quantities. These things had to be direct. They could be directed. That's why the Soviets were actually very good industrializers for a few decades. They were able to marshal all the resources of the society to building steel factories or whatever it was. They were very good at extracting the coal and the energy that was needed. And the structure of politics often had that form. So the inventions of the age, like radio and then television, was centralizing, because radio is fundamentally a one to many broadcast system, right? So that's why when a coup would take place in the 20s or 30s, you would go for two things: the presidential palace, and you would arrest the president, and the radio station, because you then had control of political power and informational power. They later became the presidential palace and then the TV station. But what the software revolution and what the internet did was they created a disaggregated world, as you put it, a networked world, where there was no one node like the central radio station or TV station. Instead, it's a multiplicity of nodes. Each node can broadcast just as well to the entire network as any other one can, and as a result, you have empowered individuals, and and think about the media structure that has developed from that, rather than the three or four big channels, or in many countries like Britain, one channel, the BBC. What you now have is a bottom up broadcasting system and a bottom up media ecosystem in which there's hundreds, thousands, and everyone is picking a sliver of that media landscape. And that, of course, means that you pick the people you like and you agree with, and then that, of course, produces polarization. So you see what I mean, which is that the structure of industrial society has a great deal to do with the politics of industrial society. The structure of post-industrial society is clearly shaping our post-industrial politics.
In other words, if we want to understand the Dutch Revolution, we go to the Reich Museum and look at the paintings of Vermeer and Rembrandt. If we want to understand the revolution we're currently looking at, Fareed, we should go on X or Facebook
Absolutely,
or Instagram.
absolutely.
Is that what you're saying?
Go look at TikTok and ask yourself, what is TikTok doing? Why is it that the late night shows on American television that used to make hundreds of millions of dollars are now losing money and will all probably wind down? Because these short form videos that are viral are taking away all the ad dollars. And what do? They tend to give you what you want, and they give you more of what you want. And so all that you see is what you already know, like, agree with, or occasionally are absolutely appalled by. Hatred is also a motivator. And that was not at all the incentive structure for the old TV networks, which had 30, 40 million people watching. So our new modern culture is much more the world of pop culture. And so, yeah, we should absolutely look. And we can also see that even in the cultural landscape, where there are a few very big mega stars. But what's really interesting about the new cultural landscape is there are thousands and thousands and thousands of stars and singers and comedians whom you and I have never heard of, but they make a few $1 million a year because they've got their little sliver of the audience for YouTube, and somebody else has their little sliver of the audience. And what we've lost, when I was first came to America, and I was in college and grad school, there were books and movies that everybody had watched and read. Tom Wolfe's Bonfire of the Vanities, everybody I knew had read. Um, Raiders of the Lost Ark, or When Harry Met Sally, everybody had seen. There's nothing like that anymore. Everybody has their own niche. Absolutely. I think the world we live in, the culture is largely pop culture, and social media is part of that world. And if you think about the old world, you had, this handful of networks and these dominant broadcast organizations, and they put out stuff for everyone. Now, what you have is something like TikTok, which is designed almost individually for you, and you get more of what you want, what you agree with, what you like. So there's a much, much greater degree of narrow, niche, siloed selectivity. And that is just part of the new reality of the media landscape. And what you lose is the common conversation. You lose the common, it's not even just the political conversation has become so polarized and each side is in its own camp, but that is a consequence of this larger technological structural shift where it's even true in the culture. When I came to America, um, everybody had read Bonfire of the Vanities in the 1980s. Everybody watched the Raiders of the Lost Ark or When Harry Met Sally. There's no such movie today. I find that when I talk to my kids, when I talk to friends, everyone has their own little niche, and everyone has watched a few of this and a few of that, and there's nothing that quite brings everybody together in a common conversation. In some ways, it's enormously productive and exciting and interesting, but you do lose that central kind of town hall feeling where everyone is participating in the same culture, in the same politics, and that is very much the result of the structure of the post-industrial age and economy we live in.
But isn't it just the inevitable logical last chapter in your narrative of individual rights, which you began in Amsterdam in the Dutch Republic? Certainly, that's what many conservative political thinkers are arguing, and it's their ideas which seem to be winning in the intellectual marketplace because progressives seem to be backward looking. Could one argue, Fareed, that TikTok is the logical, inevitable conclusion to the age of individual rights, where everyone, as you said, is served up their own ontological reality?
Yeah, absolutely. It is the heightened expression of individualism and individual autonomy, and the idea that you can construct your own definition of the pursuit of happiness, right? Um, I think that Jefferson meant something more elevated by the pursuit of happiness. I think he meant really the pursuit of knowledge and virtue. If you read his writings and if you read others around him, but yes, there is a very simple sense in which all of this heightened individual capacity and the zone for action is very much the kind of enlightenment on steroids or something like that. And partly that is what has created the backlash, because I think that at the end of the day, I'm not going to say what liberalism got wrong, because I still am a good classical liberal, but I think what classical liberalism has never had an adequate answer for is that while human beings love the freedom and the choice and the autonomy that comes from stepping into the world of Enlightenment liberalism, they don't want to be told what to believe and how to live their lives by some uh, pope or priest or imam or totalitarian commissar. What they do miss is the ideas, or the idea of something larger than all that, that is a kind of project. So they miss the certainty of faith, the endurance of tradition, the warmth of community. So all those things that came out from that old world are eroded by the acids of modernity and the acids of liberalism. But people miss them. Oh, I mean, think about so much of the great art for so much of human history was created in service of a kind of awe-inspiring God, right? And when you take that all away, you leave a hole in the heart. And liberalism has not found a way to fill that hole. I would argue the celebration of individual freedom and the celebration of individual autonomy is an absolutely heroic project. And the fact that human societies have arrived at that place where they give ordinary people this extraordinary amount of freedom and liberty and autonomy, that should be enough, but it isn't. People clearly crave something more, and that's why the right, which is able to weaponize that cultural anxiety, does well in moments of backlash, because what they offer is the politics of nostalgia, and they say we'll take you back to religion, we'll take you back to tradition, we'll take you back to community, and that actually most people don't want to go back, but they think they do, and they feel those chords, and that's, I think, the challenge for a liberal in a liberal world, in a world that has been created by liberalism. How do you fill that hole in the heart?
Yeah, I like the idea of the whole of the heart for it. In terms of existential threat to card carrying liberals like yourself, what's more dangerous, the conservative nostalgia of people like Patrick Deneen, or the state centric tech, technologism of the Chinese model?
There are many threats to classical liberalism. The Deneen model, which is pure reactionary ideology, is say we need to get back to community and tradition and faith, and quite coercively. So while Deneen elides the issue, clearly what he is arguing for is a world in which women would have fewer choices, and restricted ability
They'd listen to
to
their husbands.
listen to their, yeah, they would have to listen to their husbands. They wouldn't be able to get divorced as easily. No fault divorce would go away. They wouldn't be able to have as many abortions as they might need or want. uh, Gay rights would be limited, gay marriage would be illegal, like that. So there is a real project here which is about the stripping of all that choice and autonomy and freedom. There would be dramatically lower levels of legal immigration, let alone illegal immigration. So that project is very anti-liberal. Obviously, the Chinese project is illiberal. It's important to point out there is on the left a lot of illiberalism too. The
Mm.
whole world of DEI, and I would argue to a certain extent the extreme socialism of people like Bernie Sanders. There is, you're taking away individual rights and property and ideology. As an old-fashioned classical liberal, I still believe the right place to be is with Martin Luther King, who famously said, "I want a world in which my children will be judged by the content of their character, not the color of their skin." And the entire liberal project for 30 years went askew with this massive emphasis on race and ethnicity and ideology and gender in, as almost the defining qualities, so that your children were judged very much by the color of their skin, not by the content of their character. So I worry a lot about the threats from the left and the right.
Final question, Furi. How can liberals like yourself, and I would include myself and many of our audience, how can we ride the wave of history? How can we move forward? Anyone can quote Martin Luther King or go back to Jefferson or the Dutch Republic, but how can liberalism take advantage of this new technology, not just to create the cacophony of TikTok, but to create a world where individual rights work in a digital society?
Look, it's a great question. I don't have a simple answer to it. But what I would say is, first, be true to your ideas and your values. Don't sacrifice them. And there is a liberal temptation, as I said, on the left, to say we're not reaching our ideals fast enough. We don't have a truly egalitarian society yet. There's still too much inequality of opportunity, or there's still too much racism, or there's still too much sexism. And so we're going to now do illiberal things to achieve liberal goals. And that's a very bad path to go down. And that is so violates the core of liberalism, which is you know, you liberalism is about rules and restraints, and about, we don't tell you what kind of speech is good. We tell you we believe in free and fair speech, right? Like, yeah. So there's a sense in which by violating liberalism to achieve what you regard as just ends, you are really moving down a very illiberal path. So that's part one, which is, I think, very important. Point two is you have to recognize that societies move slowly, and you have to respect the irrational emotions and prejudices and desires that human beings have. You cannot look down on them. You cannot try to write them out of existence. If you do, you will trigger an even greater backlash. So what I mean by that is, make change, but make change slowly. Try to make change in organic ways. The writers I've always liked the most, people like Aristotle, Tocqueville, Burke, were kind of liberal conservatives or conservative liberals, and however you want to view it, because they understood that you had to recognize the organic nature of society. You had to understand that change works best when it works at a certain pace. You can't take in 2.5 million people in a country that has limited tradition of immigration as assimilation as Germany did, and not expect that there will be a backlash, and you will actually undermine the very values you believe in. And then finally, I think you have to actually be willing to celebrate liberalism, and explain and construct a kind of world that celebrates it, so that you don't lose sight of what you have. I think that in some ways the easiest the easiest sell for liberalism is in illiberal societies. Like, look at Ukraine, right? The Ukrainians are willing to die by the tens of thousands simply to get that that liberal life that we all enjoy and take for granted. They just want to be a normal liberal democracy in Europe that has the same freedoms and autonomies and breathing space that we all enjoy and take for granted. That's a model where, like, that's if they're willing to die for it, we should surely at least be willing to celebrate it as we live.
And any plans for yourself to reinvent in this new age? Get off CN, start your own Substack show?
I think about it a lot, and I have had many kind of offers. I still think there's something to be said for a big, broad platform that is accessible to everybody. I don't want to silo myself into only reaching my groupies, my fans, the people who already agree with me. So I would want whatever I did in that space, and I might well end up doing something, because who the hell knows where we're all going. But the one thing that I would look for is a big open platform where you don't have to pay to see me. And I know that that limits one's options, and it's I want to, I want everyone involved in these endeavors to be able to make a living. But I think that one of the things I can do, and I do well and have tried to do, is to speak in ways that try to persuade and not alienate, that try to bring people together. And so to do that, I would still look for these big, broad platforms, and they exist. It's not, YouTube is an obvious example, but I don't have any imminent plans, because uh, I've always thought I'd rather spend my time thinking about the history and the politics and the revolutions than think about what my business model should be. Now, if I'm forced to have a business model, if CNN closes down or fires me, or CNN, viewership radically declines, then I'll do it, and I have lots of ideas. But for now, I'm just going to try and think about revolutions.
Well, you have been thinking about revolutions, the age of revolutions, progress and backlash from 1600 to the present is out in paperback. Congratulations, uh, Fareed, and I'd love to get you back on the show in the not too distant future. Thank you so much.
Pleasure. What a stimulating conversation. Thank you.